You never want to make the argument that something like imperialism or the slave trade depends on a single thing. But I do think the texture and the practice of Atlantic expansion would have looked very different without alcohol.
A lot of the negative stereotypes and images of kind of loss of control put together in the colonial context to kind of justify European colonization would later be applied to the poorest classes' drinking practices at home.
Why should a Hogarth's image, which is an argument being made on the basis that you should keep the poor poor and keep the workers working and never let them have any leisure, why does that image still have purchase even today?
The image referred to here is Hogarth's famous engraving of Gin Lane, created in 1751 and depicting squalid scenes of gin drinking in London. But spirits had a colonial history too, and in this episode, we're investigating this in relation to Hogarth's Britain. I'm Dr. Nick Grote.
And I'm Professor Phil Withington, and you're listening to 5.5 Moments When Alcohol Shaped the World. This is our fourth moment, and it starts in the 16th century when distillation is emerging as a global industry. Distillation makes fermented drinks stronger. It turns wine into brandy, for example, or sugarcane into rum.
It so happened that European colonisation and the establishment of Atlantic slavery coincided exactly with the moment when distillation was emerging on the world scene. In this episode, among other things, Phil will be investigating whether this was more than just a coincidence.
Today I'm in the heart of Cambridge, outside the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and we're going to go inside now and look at a wonderful object which introduces the themes we're going to be thinking about today. Okay, so we're just going inside now. And here we are.
So we're looking at a calabash drinking vessel, which is a vessel that's made by taking either a gourd or something similar to a coconut that grows on a tree and cutting it in half, hollowing it out, drying it, and then, in this case, decorating it with a kind of intricate pattern. These vessels could range in size from something that would fit in your hand to something much larger, and they were common in both West Africa and the Caribbean.
I've come here to meet Dr. Lila O'Leary Chambers, who's a research fellow at Gonville Caius College in Cambridge and an expert on race, slavery and commodification in the 16th to the 18th centuries. I wanted to know what types of drinks the calabashes were used for.
So what you drank would depend on where you were. In West Africa, you would drink either palm wine or a fermented grain drink called pitu. And in the Caribbean, you would drink something called wiku, which was made by fermenting cassava.
The calabash is a nice reminder that before the arrival of Europeans on the West African coast, people had been drinking fermented drinks, most likely for millennia.
The role of alcohol in European expansion, I think, is very important. Part of what makes it so interesting in the Atlantic world is that very fact that many peoples and polities around the Atlantic already had alcohol practices. It's one of the things alongside textiles that slotted in very easily into trade practices, into political practices, into social practices. And that ability to act as a sort of mutually comprehensible medium for these type of exchanges was so important.
The west coast of Africa was crucial to European colonisation, as it was here that the Europeans brought the enslaved Africans to work in their mines and on their plantations across the ocean.
So in West Africa, there was a wide variety of drinking practices in place prior to European contact, and that continued on through European contact into the present day. It was a social lubricant. It was also really important politically for forging diplomatic relationships. It was also imbricated in rituals of justice and spirituality. So there's a practice of drinking an oath there, used to make binding agreements. There is a range of alcohols produced in West Africa before European encroachment in the region. The two most common were palm wine and pitu, which is like a grain-based alcohol that would be fermented.
But alcohol consumption was equally important to indigenous peoples on Caribbean islands, which were settled by Europeans alongside the Americas to produce cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and indigo for markets back home. Here, locals fermented fruits with high sugar content to create alcoholic drinks, but they also made a special brew from cassava called wiku, which was used at ceremonies. Making wiku involved chewing up mouthfuls of cassava, spitting it out, and leaving it to stew in a big pot.
It was consumed on significant days, whether that meant for political decision-making or because it was a coming-of-age occasion or a funeral. So it was constrained in the sense that they only drank in a large group setting for a particular reason, but you were meant to drink to the point of intoxication.
And this wasn't just the case in the Caribbean. There were similar practices in Central and South America. Dr. Deborah Toner is a leading historian of alcohol and Hispanic history. She explains that fermented alcohols had also been a feature of American indigenous societies for millennia.
Intoxication as an altered state of being was a valued state, a valued practice in both spiritual and social terms. But how that was expressed and practiced across the Americas varied widely. From Mexico south, fermented alcoholic beverages were really deeply entwined with everyday consumption practices, with religious and ritual practices, and in the case of the Inca in South America in particular, in state-sponsored, feast-based politics. The picture in North America is less clear. It's long been held that indigenous societies in North America didn't make their own fermented alcoholic drinks, but there's some evidence from major urban sites like Cahokia that suggests certainly the ritual practice of intoxication was common, and it's probably likely that they did produce their own kinds of alcoholic beers as well.
So, just as the peoples of Ghana had palm wine and pitu, and those of the Caribbean had wiku, so the inhabitants of modern-day Mexico had pulque.
It's made from the agave plant. Sap from the kind of stem of that plant is fermented to produce this highly unusual, milky white, slightly foamy, kind of bitter liquid called pulque. It's about the same alcoholic strength as beer, so a fermented alcoholic drink. Now, that's been produced in Mexico for at least 2,000 years, so really deeply embedded in material culture and ritual and religious culture in the Americas before the colonial period. We know most about practices from the Aztec Empire, where it was essentially considered a sacred beverage because the state of intoxication that it induced created the ability for human and divine entities to interact and to communicate with one another.
That indigenous peoples across the Atlantic had extensive and complex alcohol cultures, even before the arrival of Europeans, helps to nuance our understanding of the impact of European drinks and attitudes. Dr. O'Leary Chambers again.
Because Europeans came with their own cultures of alcohol consumption that were tied in with sociability, that were tied in with morality, they were able to identify and try to slot into pre-existing indigenous alcohol practices. So in West Africa, fairly early on, the English realized that not only were things like distilled spirits or, in some cases, wine valued trade goods for African consumers, they also were necessary to open up diplomatic channels, kind of gave them a way in for a variety of political rituals and interactions.
The same was true in the Caribbean, both among the indigenous inhabitants and enslaved Africans transported from Africa.
European settlers often turned to alcohol as a kind of medical treatment, and that would be true on plantations as well as on slaving ships. But they also used it as kind of a carrot and stick within the plantation complex on certain days like Christmas. Enslavers would give enslaved populations rum as this kind of it was framed as a gift, but it was a way of mitigating some of the antagonisms between the two groups. And it was also important for European sociability around the Atlantic.
But what enslaved people ate and drank wasn't just dependent on planta largesse. There's plenty of evidence suggesting they produced their own alcoholic brews.
More commonly, enslaved people requisitioned alcohol, stole alcohol from their enslavers or traded it amongst themselves on the sort of illicit marketplace. Enslaved people were often distillers, so that kind of position within the plantation hierarchy gave them access to alcohol. In one instance, actually, I found an account of an enslaved man named Mingo acquiring powder and shot for a resistance movement from the soldiers in Antigua through trading them alcohol. So he must have had access to alcohol from illicit trade, or perhaps he was friends with one of the people that worked in the still house, and he used that access to alcohol to acquire goods that would have otherwise been illicit for enslaved people to have access to.
As important as what we might call these political uses of alcohol, in terms of integration, domination, and resistance, was its economic importance. And here the significance of distilled liquors becomes very apparent.
Distillation is really important to this story because at the same moment that the Atlantic trade and enslaved people and Atlantic commodities more generally is taking off, distilling technology is really coming into its own in Europe.
Dr. Toner.
In North America, distilled spirits were a fundamental trading item between English, French, and Dutch colonists and different indigenous societies. So in the case of the British, French, and Dutch in particular, it's those really strong trading relationships that alcohol, and distilled alcohol especially, helped them to establish with indigenous societies that gave them the time and space to be able to colonize and set up their kind of settlements with any kind of sustainability.
In these empires, and Africa, alcohol and its rituals were a kind of common interest which people from different cultures could participate in and understand. This meant that distilled spirits became important for economic transactions, requiring negotiations and oaths, as well as a currency with which to buy and sell things. In the Portuguese Empire, rum also became one of the industries upon which the imperial economy rested.
For the Portuguese Empire in Brazil, the production of rum in Brazil itself was fundamental to the transatlantic slave trade. So the production of rum alongside tobacco in Brazil paid for half the enslaved Africans that were brought to Brazil to create that colony. And that's 3.5 million people in the space of a century. That process of kind of rum being produced to expand the transatlantic slave trade, to enable colonialism, was then also the key feature of colonies in the Caribbean as well, so particularly under the British and French systems.
It was a similar story in the Caribbean, as Dr. O'Leary Chambers has discovered.
The Leeward Islands in the 1720s, the governor of St. Christopher's remarks that the biggest market for their rum is actually West Africa and the most profitable. He kind of gloatingly comments that they produce the rum in St. Kitts for less than $1 and sell it on the coast of West Africa for more than 5 shillings. And it was particularly tied in that period with the slave trade. So earlier in the 17th century, alcohol for gold was more common, but as the slave trade takes off, alcohol for enslaved people becomes the kind of dominant trading relationship.
In fact, the reasons why distilled alcohol was so important to European colonialism echo the reasons why hopped beer became the ultimate capitalist commodity in late medieval Europe. It was strong and durable.
Things like wine or beer spoil much more easily than distilled alcohol. They're transportable and important to the story, but not as easily transportable as distilled alcohols. Distilled alcohol is also much higher in strength in terms of alcohol content than the indigenous alcohols that I've talked about, or wine or beer. And so that ability to intoxicate much more quickly and to a higher extent is important to how they are received.
Dr. O'Leary Chambers tells a story that captures the impact of distilled liquor on indigenous cultures familiar only with fermented drinks. It relates to an incident in the early life of a black man called Olado Equiano.
Lila O'Leary was a Black intellectual who actually lived here in Cambridge. at the end of his life, but he was enslaved as a young child and then transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean before going to North America and being eventually able to purchase his own freedom. But when he describes his introduction to the slaving ship, he talks about being sold from his initial captors to a European enslaver. And in that process of boarding the ship, he is forced to consume some rum. And rather than that kind of proving to comfort him or provide a layer of insulation from what he's enduring, he describes it as really reinforcing the dislocation he feels, kind of adding to the trauma of this experience, because it's something that he's never had before, and it intoxicates him so quickly that it makes him even more disoriented than he already was.
So aside from the Spanish Empire, where distilled spirits were much less prominent than elsewhere, strong liquor was a crucial feature of colonial interactions and economies.
You never want to make the argument that something like imperialism or the slave trade depends on a single thing. But I do think the texture and the practice of Atlantic expansion would have looked very different without alcohol.
Dr. Deborah Toner concurs.
For British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese colonialism, those empires just could not have formed in the way that they did without alcohol.
Part of this formation involved the racial and cultural stereotyping of the drinking capacities of indigenous peoples by Europeans. That these people craved intoxication and could not exert self-control or moderation was a way to legitimize taking their land and forcing them to work. But according to Dr. Toner, this stereotyping needs to be considered in context.
What's really important to remember is that at this time, Europeans didn't drink much distilled spirits themselves. So before the 16th century, Europeans produced very limited quantities of distilled spirits themselves and mainly only consumed them in small quantities for medicinal purposes. And it's over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries that recreational practices of drinking distilled spirits on a larger scale took shape in Europe. So the Europeans, as they were writing these observations about Native Americans and other indigenous groups, didn't have their own clear sense of social norms around how to consume distilled spirits in an orderly way. And I think a lot of the negative stereotypes and images of kind of loss of control that they put together in the colonial context to kind of justify European colonization would later be applied in slightly different ways, but in very similar ways too, to the lower classes and the poorest classes' drinking practices at home.
In fact, the European rhetoric about indigenous drunkenness in many ways reflected the rhetoric about marginal groups back in Europe.
So you can't talk about alcohol without mentioning Hogarth, Beer Street and Gin Lane. And I think that that's a really good example of a similar kind of stereotypical idea of the impact of distilled spirits consumption on poor people in England, very similar to the kind of rhetorical and observational descriptions that we see about indigenous practices of consumption in the 17th century.
This is a fascinating connection to make, and one I wanted to explore further with Dr. Angela McShane, who's an expert on the cultural history of intoxicants at the University of Warwick. I asked her about the context for William Hogarth's famous prints from 1751 of a decrepit Gin Lane in the centre of which an emaciated drunken woman has discarded her baby to take snuff, and a prosperous Beer Street where industrious and fecund men and women drink beer and flirt with each other. She began by explaining the growth of the spirits trade in England in the later 17th century.
So the Distillers' Company is set up in 1638. So we know certainly that distillation is happening, certainly in England, at scale from that period. But mostly distillation is for the purposes of spirits that are used for medical uses, mostly in English culture. And in fact, those parts of Great Britain and all the islands and so on that were known as drinkers of spirits, and we could perhaps highlight here the Irish and their usquebaugh and whiskey in Scotland, were very much denigrated by the English for their, ridiculous behaviour. The hubris then of the 1680s, by which time we know that spirituous liquors are definitely being drunk much more. In southern England, actually, is what Charles Davenant says, who's an excise officer. He notes that partly because French brandy has been coming in, partly because of colonial rum that has been coming in. So different kinds of spirits have been arriving in Britain, and they've particularly contributed to the development of a punch culture.
This punch culture is already well established when the Glorious Revolution of 1689 brings the Dutch Prince of Orange, William III, to the throne, along with his wife Mary and a large Dutch entourage. William's primary aim is to wage war against his Catholic enemies, including James Stuart in Ireland and Louis XIV in Europe.
And in order to get, as it were, Parliament on his side, there's currently a glut of corn. There's a lot of MPs who are landowners. And so he promotes a bill, an act in 1690 for the promotion of distillation in England. So up until now, mostly this stuff has been imported and it's not necessarily been made in Britain very much. Genever, or gin, which was seen as a Dutch product, then becomes a big craze in London, probably to start with, and the south. But it's being made in England for the first time. It takes off, I suppose, partly because of these, these soldiers, young women coming to London, this new drink, new ways of drinking, tiny little tankards, absolutely, gorgeous. Who doesn't love a little thing? Women particularly do. But also, it's got a national story. It's actually not Dutch, it's British, it's English. So that, I think, adds a certain flavour, if you like, to the drinking of it.
For Dr. McShane, what is striking is that this craze for gin, a malt spirit flavoured with juniper berries, is that it was much more socially inclusive than the previous punch culture of brandy and rum. The deregulation of the trade meant that poorer sorts of men and women could make and sell it, and various other factors, including a rise in the standard of living, meant that the working classes were also conspicuous consumers. Confronted by democratisation of strong liquors, moralists and magistrates began to scratch two familiar itches in ways that, in certain respects, resemble colonial rhetoric.
There has always been a concern to police the pleasures of the poor. The poor are always seen as dangerous. So in all the sermons we can look at in the 17th century, the main fear is what's going to happen if the poor become drunk, because they will get out of control. Whereas when the rich become drunk, which they do all the time, and they're also castigated, they do that behind doors, closed doors. Their actions are immoral for them personally, but it doesn't have an impact on the economy as a whole. Whereas if the poor who do all the work and are absolutely fundamental to the army, fundamental to every part of the economy, if they get out of control, if they're not capable, then the entire economy will fall apart.
But it's not just the poor who worry the moralists. There's another very influential group of people that they're seriously concerned about.
Women, because women are going to produce all the next generations. They are also seen as a kind of moral bellwether in many ways for society. So if women begin to behave badly, then this is equally going to be disastrous for society and the economy. So these young women who are beginning to be thrilled by this different kind of drink and also hobnobbing with the many, many single men that there are in London and elsewhere, the ports. I mean, you've got to think about all the different ports and so on as well. This is happening. That is, again, promoting fear.
It was these fears, rather than the realities of drinking practices themselves, that Hogarth was mobilising in 1751.
people think about them and talk about them as being something that Hogarth, kind of thought of for himself. But really what they are is an illustration of a pamphlet by Henry Fielding, which laid out all the horrors of gin, that it was, responsible for crime, that it was responsible for infant mortality, it was responsible for, the whole collapse potentially of the British economy. And so Hogarth is reproducing those arguments in what's this iconotext, as they're called. So obviously they're not photographs, they are opinions, they're arguments.
It seems the case then that there really are similarities between the impact of distilled spirits across the Atlantic and closer to home. In both instances, ruling male elites encouraged the provision of spirits for recreational, political, and economic reasons. And in both instances, they then stigmatized the drinking of people who were supposed to be under their authority: the poor, women, indigenous groups. We've seen that in Africa, the Caribbean, and much of America, this provisioning was fundamental to European colonialism. In Britain, perhaps it was the ferocity of the rhetoric and the quality of Hogarth's draftsmanship that was ultimately most impactful.
Do you know what? I really think the saddest thing about this story is that it simply embedded old attitudes and there was no escape. Why should Hogarth's image, which is an argument being made on the basis that you should keep the poor poor and keep the workers working and never let them have any leisure, why does that image still have purchase even today?
That was Dr. Angela McShane ending our fourth moment in 5.5 moments when alcohol shaped the world. Your narrator was my colleague, Professor Phil Withington. I'm Dr. Nick Grote, and as an archaeologist, I find the research covered in this episode absolutely fascinating. It gives us an insight into the role and use of alcohol in indigenous populations and amongst enslaved people, and changes a common perception that alcohol was imposed on colonised people, and it was the colonisers alone who controlled its use or misuse. I think the links between the condemnation of spirits in the Americas and Britain are also really interesting. Dr. McShane makes us question the accepted historical view of women and the poor being ruined by gin drinking in Hogarth's Britain, and the political motives of those who commission this propaganda. In the next episode, we jump forward to the 19th century and look at the role of alcohol in the world's first industrial society. Phil will be exploring the importance of alcohol in the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of the bio-state.